welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm her dad. I'm Stephen and Fehr. I'm these days an organisational psychologist, but I was raised in a cultic group. So welcome to the podcast.
Did you know I've been lying on the intro this whole time?
Have you? Why?
Well, I always say a media graduate, but that's not entirely true. I'm a media and English graduate.
Well, yes.
Surprise everyone. I also, half my degree is English literature.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think I wrote the introduction, so it's probably my fault that. But yeah, I said media because I thought that's more sort of relevant. But
it is, yeah.
Yeah,
but
I suppose it is true. Technically, you are.
Sneaker,
of course,
sneaker book
you do know
reference.
your. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Good. Well, today it's a topic. So you might have noticed, listeners, if you're new to the podcast, because we've had quite an increase in listeners over the last few weeks, last month or so. So if you're kind of new here, welcome. Thanks for joining us again. We generally have a topic episode, which is me and Celine exploring a topic related to cults. And then the following week, we tend to have a guest. So that's the way we normally do it. Sometimes it doesn't quite work out, but that's how we normally operate. So this week is a topic episode, and it's been something that I've wanted to talk about really this week because we've had something happen in the UK that's very parochial, I suppose, but it's absolutely has taken the country by storm. So I want to talk about that very briefly, but it is relevant to organisations and a wider question. So we've had this thing called the post office scandal that has really hit the headlines. It's actually been going on for 20 years, but only now, because there was a dramatisation of it on TV, has it really captured the imagination. And you just read an article about it. Do you want to summarise what you've read about it, Celine?
So yeah, I read like a quick BBC, what is going on with the post office scandal? So it was designed in, explicitly for someone like me who's Googling, what is going on? Because, started hearing it, but I don't really know what it means. So what I read was that basically there was a software called Horizon that was to be used for basically the bookkeeping. It was like a software for.
Yeah. Can I just, sorry to interrupt, I've asked you to do it and I'm now interrupting you, but I just wanted to, for listeners that are not based in the UK, they might not, I mean, obviously everybody has post offices in every country, but they're all organised a bit differently. In the UK,
we have a government-owned postal service. Yeah, so
right.
if we start there, we have a government-owned postal service, and that's probably key to know at the top. Number two, there was a software that was buggy. This software was around the bookkeeping. The people that handled that side of things, in terms of like the post masters and mistresses, as they're referred to, it sounds very old-fashioned, doesn't it? But I suppose it's an old system. But anyway, they were. I think some of them start to notice it's buggy, don't they? Because they start to worry. And I saw one of the lines in this article even says some people started trying to put their own money into the accounts to balance them because they were worried about potential repercussions, which it would seem they were right to be worried about, because quickly the finger begins to be pointed at these postmasters and mistresses that are using this software to balance to enable them to balance the books and so on. People start going to prison, being convicted, losing their livelihoods. I think it affected, people said it affected their lives in general, because people thought, they were criminals, that they were liars, affecting relationships and so on.
Yeah, some people ended up taking their own lives because of it as well. So it's really, really tragic.
And it's affected a lot of people as well. I think, they were trialing quite a lot of people for this.
There's a couple of extra things to say. One is that these postmasters and mistresses are generally often they're older. They're like, it's like their retirement plan, really. So they're kind of pillars of the community. Imagine a little village, you just got a post office in it, and they also run the local shop. And it's kind of just part of the village or town, and it's got that very English sort of quaintness about it, I think, and that's part of, I think, the shock of this. You've got these people who are just ordinary people, small business people. They run them themselves, so it is their own business. It's like a franchise system. So if anything is short, if they're short on the accounts each week, then they're expected to put the money in. But we're talking about thousands of pounds. There was a TV dramatisation starring Toby Jones, who's quite a well-known English actor, and in this we see one of the postmistresses, because this is the thing, they were all calling the helpline saying, look, I'm really having trouble with this. I'm really worried about this. Can you please help me? And so instead of helping them, they made it worse. On one of the occasions, they talked her through doing something, and it doubled the amount that she now owed. They then send people round. And the other thing to note that is a kind of peculiarity of the British Postal Service, it's because it's so old, it's hundreds of years old, is that the post office have their own investigation and prosecution powers. So unlike most businesses where you'd have to call the police in, they don't need to do that. They do it themselves. So literally the post office was sending them to prison. Absolutely shocking. It's been a big scandal, obviously, and this has gone on for 20 years. People have died in the meantime, still owing this money. It's ruined people's lives.
Yeah, because
It's
it has been
shocking.
deemed their due compensation, hasn't it?
Yeah, but they've only got a small amount because there's so many people involved. It had to be split amongst the how many? I think there was
at least like 500.
Yeah, there's 500 in the first tranche, but there's more to come. So yeah, it's a real scandal. If you're not in the UK, you can watch it through a VPN. ITVX is the app, so you can watch it that way. I think at the moment that's the only way you're going to be able to watch it. But the story's everywhere. You can read about the story. I've heard about this story on podcasts for quite some time, but only now is it really taken off. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is, I know it is a little bit parochial, but is because
when you say parochial, what do you mean?
What do I mean? Well, it's a bit local. It's
Yeah.
kind of only people from the UK kind of will know about this story. But the reason why it's important, bearing in mind that most of our listeners are not in the UK, but it's another example of an organisation or the people in an organisation behaving really, really badly. And sometimes in organisations where they behave badly, it's obvious why they're doing it. It's because they're greedy and they want money. It's often money's at the heart of it. But in this case, and in many cases, and we've probably all seen it in our own work lives, people do some pretty ethically indefensible things on behalf of an organisation, on behalf of their company. And there doesn't seem to be that much in it for them. It's just because it's their company. They work for that company. These people that did this terrible thing to all these postmasters and mistresses, they didn't get anything out of it. It wasn't like they were, not directly anyway. I mean, obviously, ultimately, I suppose they didn't want to take the losses for the company, and that would have looked bad for them. But you don't get the sense that people in this are rubbing their hands thinking, oh, I'm going to make this person suffer and that's going to make me some money somewhere. It's just the system. It's the way that the system worked, and the decisions that individual managers, senior managers and middle managers made at the time. And that, I think, is fascinating. And it got me thinking about cults and religious organizations as well, where people do some pretty horrific things. And you have to ask why, what's happening psychologically here? Why are people doing awful things for their religion or their cult or their business? So that's the relevance for me here. If people can behave like that in the post office, because they think they're doing it on behalf of their organization, then, obviously it can happen in cults and other organizations too. So, yeah, I think it's quite interesting. What are the mechanisms? So that's really what I want to explore.
And I think you said that you wanted to talk about this in kind of 3 segments. So
Yeah,
should we
that's
start
right.
with the beginning? Let's
Yeah,
start
so
with segment
the
1.
three segments are organizational psychology. So, what does organizational psychology tell us about this sort of phenomena? And then I want to talk about individual psychology. So I'm going to touch on something called the Dark Triad today. I wanted to talk about the Dark Triad for quite some time because it's really cool.
It does
It's
sound
got that
quite
cool
dramatic. It
name.
feels like
Yeah.
it feels very anime, I'm sorry. It feels like
Yeah.
someone should like look up dramatically and the glasses glint and they're like, it's the Dark Triad.
It's the Dark Triad. So we're going to talk about that. And then the other one is obviously we want to bring it back to cults and religious settings as well, I suppose. So let's start with the organizational psychology. I'm going to quote some papers, but I'm not going to bore you, hopefully, with them. I'll put the links on the show notes. If people want to read these papers, they can. They're all open access, so you can download and read them. There's 3 papers. There's one particular researcher who seems to come up quite a bit on this research called Umfress. It's a very strange name. So this paper, Umfress, Bingham and Mitchell, the title of the paper is Unethical Behavior in the Name of the Company, the moderating effect of organizational identification and positive reciprocity beliefs on unethical pro-organizational behavior.
So only a small title.
As always, a snappy title.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
the rolls off the tongue. Academics really got
this is what you have to put up with when you're doing academic research. Basically, they tested whether it was all about identification, because I think that's the first thing that I would go to. Is it because you identify with your business? So when you start at a company, and we've all done this, when you first start, you're new, and if you like working there, and even if you don't like working there, there's a kind of element of this is now my tribe. I identify with this organization.
Well, immediately you all refer to yourself as we.
That's right. It's an in-group, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very much so, because the company wants you to be bought in.
That's right.
Go on about buy-in all the time. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, it's a very interesting term, that buy-in, isn't it? It's like it gives you the sense of a transaction there. You're giving something of yourself and you're getting something in return. That's what organizations want. So this identity, is it a sense of identity that you're identifying with the organization that means that you're willing to do unethical things? So they tested whether this was the factor, a sense of identification with the organization. Does it increase what they call unethical pro-organizational behavior? And again, with academics, they always like to give it 3-letter acronyms. So it gets called a UPB. So in the documentation, it's all UPB, but so it's unethical pro-organizational behavior. In other words, doing bad things for the good of the company, and whether this was amplified by the strength of the individual's reciprocity beliefs. So actually there's 2 factors they're trying to research here. One is this feeling of identification, and the other is this reciprocity beliefs. So reciprocity beliefs are basically you thinking that if I'm loyal to the company, then the company will give me something back in return. So there's, is that important as well? These beliefs about this reciprocity. So have you got any questions before I go on?
No, so are we going to start with the identity bit and then we'll do the reciprocity
Yeah,
bit?
well, what they found, I'll just give you the results of the study. There were 2, they actually have 2 studies in this paper, and I'll read the results from study 2. It says results from study 2 are consistent with the findings from study 1. So they basically agree with each other. Organizational identification was not significantly and directly related to UPB, which I found fascinating and surprising, as did they, because their first hypothesis was that identification with the organization would itself be significant. So
they found it wasn't.
They found it wasn't. Yeah. So this is all done through survey data, so that people are asked to fill in surveys, and I think there may have been an experiment in this as well. But they couldn't find any statistically significant effect there. on its own. So this suggests that organizational identification alone does not provide enough impetus for UPB. However, we again found support for the organizational identification times the positive reciprocity beliefs interaction. In other words, you have to have the two at the same time. So these two things work together. So a sense of identification with the organization multiplied by the amount of positive reciprocity belief. So the amount that I think, I'm likely to get rewarded for this sort of behavior. Those two things together will make people more likely to do unethical things for the sake of the organization, which I think is quite interesting.
That is interesting, isn't it? So, and yeah, that's by far the motivating factor in this over the identity part, which is
which
generally what we
surprised me.
talk about all the time, identity, don't we? So you'd think that would be.
So trying to relate this to, religious settings or cult settings. So, you think about my old group, the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have people doing things like telling lies essentially about what their organization does. I should mention this week is the first week of the trial in Norway. So listeners, if you've not listened yet to Jan Frode Nielsen, his interview, I suggest you do that because it's absolutely fascinating. But I think he's not doing anything until Friday. I think he's going to be one of the witnesses for the state on Friday, I do believe he said. But here you have the organisation essentially denying that shunning does anything other than stop spiritual association, that normal family association is not affected. When their own drama, which incidentally was played in the courtroom, demonstrates that isn't true. And so you're left thinking, well, how can these people, some of whom are actually Jehovah's Witnesses, how can they say things that are clearly not true? This is a lie. That's unethical. But clearly they're doing it because they want to be loyal to the organization. So this research might suggest that, yes, organizational identity is important. So they feel that they are identifying with this organization, but it's also related to this positive reciprocity.
So in this example, let's say with the lying about the spiritual association, shunning, and that sort of thing. If you were to be sort of overlaying this study onto that, would you say it was less to do with identifying as a Jehovah's Witness and more to do with wanting the positive things that come with being a Jehovah's Witness to keep happening?
Yeah, I think the two have to come together. So that the research suggests that it's not that identity is not important; it's just that on its own it's not enough, and that's why that suggests why the organisation continues to push the idea of living forever in paradise. All the wonderful things that are going to happen if you stay loyal to Jehovah. So that's your sense is okay. It's in the future, but something good is going to happen to me in the future because of what I'm doing now. I'm staying loyal, even though I'm saying something that isn't true. But I'm doing so for the benefit of Jehovah's organization, and I'm going to get my reward in the new system. So I think it absolutely can apply there.
Okay, cool.
Okay, there's another paper called "The Role of Moral Decoupling in the Causes and Consequences of Unethical Pro-organizational Behavior."
See, I was about to say that one was a bit better title when it stopped at uncoupling, but then you took a breath and you carried on, and I was like,
believe
it's
it or
not
not,
as snappy as I thought.
Believe it or not, there's more, but I'm not going to read the rest of it. This is why it is hard to do degrees, because everything's so complicated. So this is written by Fehr, Welsh, Baer, and Vaulont. 2019, so it's quite a recent bit of research, which is great. I like to find ones that are quite recent. So this is quite an interesting concept. This is called moral decoupling. So they're looking at this idea of moral decoupling, and the example it gives in the paper is like people's opinion of Tiger Woods. So if you remember Tiger Woods, he had a bit of a scandal. He was found to be cheating on his wife,
yeah.
and all sorts of things that his squeaky clean image didn't sort of reconcile. So people didn't like what he'd done. But the question is, do you still like Tiger Woods? And where moral decoupling works, it says, you basically say, well, I don't like what he does, or I don't like what he did, but he's still a great golfer. I mean, the other one for me is like Tom Cruise. I actually really like Tom Cruise films generally, and he's actually quite a good actor, in a sort of limited range that he does. But his involvement with Scientology and his behaviour around that is awful, and so sometimes you have this difficult dilemma.
I think we discuss it a lot in terms of from a media and English perspective. You discuss it a lot when it's like, do you stop reading books by people that have in your opinion, bad opinions, or like, it's often the question with Harry Potter. Do you stop engaging with Harry Potter because you don't feel good about J.K. Rowling? Or can you, I suppose, decouple it and just engage with the media? Right. So it's a quite common conversation at the minute, isn't it?
It is. And the suggestion here is that people that are better at doing that, better at moral decoupling, are more likely to do things that are considered to be unethical. So when employees believe that their supervisor, so this is a big factor here, which I think is very important. So the idea is that supervisors set the example, of course. So if I, as an employee, see my supervisor doing things that are unethical but delivering on performance, then I'll be more willing to mirror that behaviour, to do the same thing. So we and it gives examples like lying to customers, withholding information from the public. And when supervisors self-report that they separate ethics from performance, so this ability to separate the ethics from the performance, I've got to do it. I have to do it because it's. I just thought about an example in sport, so in football or soccer. Sometimes we talk about the professional foul. The professional foul is when you foul somebody, you're doing it, you're going to get a yellow card, maybe, you're going to get punished for it, but you have to do it because maybe the opposition is about to score a goal or something. So you'll handball it or you'll kick him up in the air. And it's wrong, but you do it anyway because performance comes above the ethics. And there it seems to be that the example of the leadership is very, very important. So again, that's interesting. And again, applying that to religious settings, again, we can use the same example. If I'm a normal publisher and I see a circuit overseer lying about what shunning actually is, I'm going to think, well, the ends justify the means, essentially, and that's what I must do. So that's quite interesting. And the final paper I'm going to look at is by Chen and Sheldon. So either a married couple or just happen to be two Chens that maybe it's a very common name.
I did really believe that you were going to say it again. I really thought it was going to be Chen and Chen.
Chen and Chen, yeah.
Yeah, I would
Chen
have
squared.
enjoyed it. It's like when we were getting this train once, and it just, I swear, I think we were actually just really tired because it was like 4 a.m, but we swear it said cruelly like 7 times in a row. They're all just slight variations. Anywho,
right.
What did they publish?
Yeah. So anyway, so this is the relaxing moral reasoning to win: how organizational identification relates to unethical pro-organizational behavior. So this, we're going back here to this identification, and they actually see a bit more evidence for this, for the identification element, which is quite interesting. Again, they're testing whether identification with the organization makes this UPB, unethical pro-organizational behavior, more likely. And they're also looking at mediators. So what things, again, coupled with that, tend to create it. So they look at moral disengagement and competitive inter-organizational relations. So moral disengagement is quite interesting. There's 3 psychological phenomena that that contribute to moral disengagement. This is related to Bandura, who's a very well-known psychologist. So what tends to happen is, in order to morally disengage, essentially you're doing three things. The first is to reconstrue unethical acts so as to make them appear amoral, less immoral, or even respectable. So I think that's really interesting, and we do that, don't we? If we're going to do something immoral, or unethical, we might try to justify what we're doing as not that bad.
Yeah.
So it's not that bad, really. This is, at the very least, it's just, this is the way the game is played. It's
or it's like if you're not telling someone something, but you're not directly lying, you're like, well, we're not lying. If they ask, and you can be like, if they ask, we'll tell them. If they don't ask, I'm not going to tell them.
And everybody does it. This is normal for this industry. It's normal that you don't tell people the full cost of ownership. You just sort of don't mention that bit. That's normal. Everybody does that. So that's the first one. The second is to obscure or distort both responsibility for and the consequences of such conduct. So obscure and distort responsibility and the consequences. So it's not that bad. At the end of the day, they're not getting hurt that much, and it's not really my fault. I'm just doing what everybody does, and my boss has told me to do it anyway, so I'm kind of passing the responsibility on to somebody else. So that's quite interesting. And the third one is to devalue the target of the unethical conduct, which I think is fascinating.
To make it sound like, well, they're not very good at what they do anyway, so why should we worry about it?
It's their fault, really.
Yeah.
Or who cares about them?
To ask. If they were clever enough to ask, then I would have told them the truth, but they weren't. So
yeah, who cares about the muggles? So it's that kind of justified because actually they don't deserve to be treated any differently. So I think that's quite interesting. And the inter-organizational element there is competition. So I think again that's very, very interesting. So the greater the sense that you are in competition with another or other organizations, the more you're likely to do unethical things. And that again makes sense. It's another reason why cults in particular and organizations often try to create a very much us and them sort of environment. You start to feel under siege. If you're under siege, whether that be through competitors or others, then you feel this increased sense of, well, you just have to do what it takes because we're under attack. And cults do that brilliantly. It really is all about persecution, and we're up against the rest of the evil world and the evil system of things, and then you start to justify things that you probably wouldn't justify otherwise. So I think that's all really interesting. Thank you for listening to Cult Hackers, an indie podcast. That means we're not part of a big media organisation with huge advertising budgets and massive reach. So just by listening to this, you're supporting the little guy. The hardest thing for us is not content. We love recording episodes and talking to amazing and interesting people. Now, by far the hardest thing is getting in front of the potential millions of listeners out there, with millions of podcasts scrambling for attention. And here's where you can help. Simply by telling people about the podcast. Just telling somebody about it can really help. You can share an episode on social media or private messaging using your app, or on some apps you can leave a rating, and better still, say a few words. So please help us get Cult Hackers in front of more people. And now back to the podcast.
So that sort of sets the scene then. This was part one.
So that's I suppose that's the organizational psychology element of it.
Through the lens of business.
Yeah, and what all of these do, it's kind of seeing the individuals within the organization less. You're seeing them less in a way. We're saying that this is situational, that organizations create these conditions that drive people's behavior. So that's more social psychology, really. what we're going to do now is think about the individuals, because all of that so far has assumed that these people are generally good people, let's say, generally make ethical choices, but it's the situation, it's the organization that creates that thing that's happening. What we're going to do, have a look at now, is a bit more kind of individual psychology, because we're going to talk about the Dark Triad.
Yes.
So have you come across the Dark Triad before, Celine?
No.
Obviously not, because you thought it was an anime.
Yes, or it sounds like it would be in an anime.
Yeah, so we did this in our undergraduate course, and it is kind of fascinating. There's something about it, but basically, the Dark Triad are 3 psychological tendencies, traits that tend to be quite high in criminals and people that do bad things.
Are you saying
and these 3,
something called the Dark Triad is in fact not something we should be aspiring toward?
no, strangely enough. Yeah,
I was
fully
expecting
enough.
it to be the 3-step program to happiness.
Right. No. So the first characteristic is this thing called Machiavellianism.
Okay.
Machiavellianism. So as a English, you may have come across Machiavelli.
Well, it's one of those things that I think would be great on our shared favourite podcast, potentially, of origin stories, because and maybe they've already done this one. I'm working my way through their back catalogue, but it's one of those things that gets thrown around a lot, but the actual origins of what does it mean to be Machiavellian, we didn't end up covering. But they did mention
Interesting.
it sometimes. Yeah.
Okay.
So what do you mean?
Well, Machiavelli is a historical character who actually lived, and he wrote a book called The Prince, I think it's called. It's kind of the rule book for politicians, I believe. You know, all politicians will have read The Prince. But Machiavellianism is this. It's a set of behaviours that I'll quote here the paper. It's the paper I'm taking this from actually is Le Breton, Chivadecker, Grimaldi, and they define Machiavellianism as being a strategy of social conduct that involves manipulating others for personal gain. So this is the character in court. So imagine going back to the kings and queens, the characters behind the scenes that are doing all the politicking.
It's a triangulator. You know, and you triangulate. So you don't talk to the person you actually want to do something. You talk to the other points on the triangle such that they do what you want them to do.
Yeah, they're very, and there's a debate as to how much the man was actually like this, but there is a sense that it's a lot of sneakiness, there's unethical behavior, there's lying, there's threats, there's the dark arts, really. Machiavellianism is really all about that. So it's this manipulation of people, getting them to do what you want them to do. They don't often, or they don't always know that they're doing your bidding, so you're putting ideas in their head. Exactly. Yeah.
Inception, ultimately Machiavellian.
Yeah, I suppose so. My point here is that if you're that type of person, then no surprise that in organizations then you behave badly. So I think it's important to realize that it sometimes it is situational, but sometimes it is just because there are some really bad actors in these organizations. As a Jehovah's Witness, there would be certain characters, sometimes elders, who would behave in pretty unpleasant ways, actually, and sometimes you wondered whether they did it because they enjoyed it. So yeah, you do get some actually quite unpleasant people, and obviously power attracts this type of person. So no surprise that they often get quite high up in organizations, or at least have some level of power and control. So that's the first one.
Parts,
that's just one. Yeah, so that's one of the triad. The second one is narcissism. So we know about narcissism. It's kind of been a bit of a buzzword for the last couple of years. So again, I'm going to read the definition of this from the paper because it's quite good. Higher levels of narcissism are likely to A, harbour feelings of superiority driven by an inflated or grandiose sense of self. B, have a dysfunctional need for excessive attention and admiration. C, have a propensity for engaging in exploitative acts or behaviours. And D, lack empathy, tending toward callousness. So that nicely defines narcissism. And again, you can imagine in organisations people doing bad things because that's the way they are. They just want to be the person in power and have everybody love them. Clearly, a lot of cult leaders are likely to have this dark triad. I don't know if there's any good research that's been done to support that. But that would be my hypothesis, that cult leaders often have high levels of these dark triad psychological traits to them.
Don't keep us in suspense. What is the third?
And the final one is psychopathy. And yeah, so and again, I'll just read the definition of that. This is actually, they're quoting from Williams et al. They summarize psychopathy along 4 key dimensions: interpersonal manipulation. So, for example, grandiosity, lying, superficial charm. Secondly, callous affect, lack of empathy, lack of remorse. Thirdly, erratic lifestyle. That's impulsivity, irresponsibility, and sensation seeking. And fourth, criminal tendencies, antisocial or counterproductive behavior. In this article, they do make a distinction between clinical and subclinical examples of psychopathy in particular, because psychopathy is actually it's in the DSM. It is actually recognised as a psychological condition.
It includes things like sociopath and psychopath, doesn't it? Those sorts of things.
Yeah. So sociopath, as far as I understand it, sociopathy isn't part of the DSM, but it's a kind of more it explains psychopathic behavior sort of thing. Psychopathy is actually defined as a medical condition, or psychological condition, I should say. But yeah, there is this clinical and subclinical diagnosis. So I would say, you can be a bit of a psychopath, believe it or not.
There's
whereas,
not a definitive line.
No, exactly. Yeah. So some people won't go into the area where they are criminals, but they still have psychopathic tendencies, which is quite interesting. I watched a television program about this topic, and the researcher who was researching it realized that he actually had a lot of the qualities that he was looking at in psychopathy, which was really interesting. So yeah. The dark triad. So sometimes people do bad things in organizations because they're bad people. It can be as simple as that.
Do you think that? So here's a question, because obviously we spend a lot of time acknowledging that people are in cults are victims of cults as well, and we don't like to kind of talk badly about the rank and file of groups because but we also interview people that have had really bad experiences with people that are just in the group at the same kind of level as them. So do you think that is because there's more people with this kind of dark triad, or is it something else? Like what's going on?
So I would obviously, I've not done any research, so whatever I say is just an opinion, really. But I would suggest that the most likely situation is that if you were to measure the amount of people with these dark triad traits in a cult compared to people that have them outside of a cult, I would be surprised if there was much of a difference in the amount of people that have these qualities. I don't think cults attract people with these.
No. Do you
apart from the leadership? The leadership, yes.
So it's like the general population. Again, this is just sort of theorizing. You think will probably be the same, but obviously power attracts those kinds of people, regardless of if it's in a cult or not in a cult. But obviously in a cult, it could have the potential to be more dangerous in a way, because you've got even more control and power over people's lives. But
if you're this sort of person, then
yeah,
what better
Mm.
what better situation to find yourself in than the leader of a cult? It is absolutely tailor made for you.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's sort of apply this now to, or let's think about the cultic and religious factors here, because we've demonstrated that these sorts of things, so unethical behaviour, can happen because people are essentially bad, or it can be because of this identification with the organisation and this sense of reciprocity. And we also do these moral. We sort of disengage from morals sometimes on the basis of performance is more important. So we've seen that. But in cults, it has this extra, if it's religious, it has this extra element, which is that you think you're doing it for God or for a much greater cause. And I think that adds a whole other layer of danger to this situation. And I was thinking, there's a quote that I was trying to find. I found it in the end. It's by Blaise Pascal, who says, "Men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction."
Mm.
And that is so true, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So people sometimes do terrible things. We know this, because they think that it's what God wants them to do, or that God is telling them to do it, or it's for the greater good.
All the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People also. So again, I was thinking about this lying question, because most people know that lying is generally unethical. But there's situations where you might lie, and that would be completely ethical. So if the Nazis were trying to find Anne Frank and they asked you where does she live, are you going to give her away because you can't lie? Well, obviously not.
It's
So
this effective altruism thing, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. So sometimes lying is completely ethical, but generally speaking, if there's no consequences, then you would expect to tell the truth. That's the moral and ethical stance. But again, when I was a witness, the question I was asked to think about is, does the person asking have a right to know? And this is why I think this is how they justify telling lies to governments, or to other authorities about their processes and the things that they do, because actually you can always say that God's law comes before man's, therefore they don't have a right to know that information, and so that justifies, or can justify, pretty much anything. So there have been, my memory is very hazy about it, so I'm not going to go into it, but I do remember as a child a situation cropping up where a person was expected to lie to the authorities, or say something wasn't true. I remember me saying, well, that's wrong, because lying is wrong. But no, it's not lying, because the person doesn't have a right to know, which I think is very, very interesting.
Lying, spade's a spade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lying
Yeah.
is
But this
lying.
again, claiming that disfellowshipping, shunning doesn't affect people's relationships at all, only spiritual relationships, that is a lie. And they know it's a lie, but still they are able to say it, because as I said, the answer will be, well, they don't have a right to know this.
Yeah, and I suppose also in another thing as well is hiding the information around the. So a lot of religious groups have been found out to be hiding sort of sexual assault information, and something that a few people, when they've came on and talked about it with us, have said that they were kind of advised, don't take your brother to court.
That's right.
So I suppose there's this thing of not wanting to be the one that blows the whistle.
Absolutely.
Because it's not just about individual instances, it's about the whole image thing, isn't it, as well?
Yes, that's that can be particularly difficult for organisations that try to have a particular image, and Jehovah's Witnesses are particular examples of that. Their very name is testifying or testimony to their God, and so I was brought up to think about every single thing that I did. Is that going to bring praise to Jehovah's name? And if I was naughty at school, or if I did something wrong, that was doubly painful, because not just that I got into trouble, but I was besmirching Jehovah's name, and that's so it's the tendency to hide things that make the organization look bad is just so great there, because it's this worry, this fear of damaging the reputation. But all organizations worry about their reputation, of course. But it's particularly bad within these sorts of religious groups, I think.
Because I guess the way we're talking about it as well is that most people generally, obviously, we've discussed this Dark Triad kind of group as the outlier, but generally people do want to kind of follow the status quo and do the right thing, don't they? Like you say, most people know that lying's wrong, or that most people want to do the ethical thing. So I suppose that's why it's interesting to see how these sort of studies show how organizations can get around the natural inclination to do the right thing. Because I think I want to kind of be positive in saying that I think people generally do want to do the right thing. And that,
I think so.
Yeah, and that's why these groups are having to, I suppose, go to fairly great length to make it so that people get comfortable with doing the not right thing.
Yeah, and they're able to twist what is right. So if you're able to change the definition of what right and wrong is, then of course, people will again happily, cheerfully do what everybody else thinks are terrible things, but they think they are doing something wonderful. A suicide bomber, they're not doing it because they think what they're doing is evil. They're doing it because they genuinely believe what they're doing is right.
I suppose,
and that's the power of it.
I suppose what would be good to touch on as well. So I was recently watching the Twin Flames documentary. So that's around another sort of cult group. And there was a really interesting point from Yanya on there. So Yanya Lalich, it's been on the show with us before, sort of an expert in the cult scene, and she was talking about how in groups, or at least in cultic groups, everyone kind of becomes a perpetrator as well, because you're expected to uphold all of the same stuff that's being thrust upon you. That's you're a victim of it, but then you're also expected to do that to others, or keep people following the rules, whatever. And that was quite interesting. So I think for people that have come out, that's something that is quite hard.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, related to that is something else I jotted down in my notes, was that zealotry sometimes is a mechanism to fight against cognitive dissonance. So, and I think I felt this quite strongly as a cult member, was, if I could pioneer, if I could spend more time on the ministry, if I could do this thing or that thing, that would demonstrate my faith. So when you have doubts, it's easy to overcompensate, essentially, and try and do everything you
Double
can.
down.
Yeah, and you do that even though deep down I mean, we've seen examples of this with people who are vehemently opposed to homosexuality and to gay people, and they've passed laws and tried to ban all sorts of activity, and then we find out that they themselves have had homosexual affairs, or they actually are gay. And it's this overcompensating for you're trying to hold a line. How do I hold this line? I double down. I do more. I do more. I do more. And in doing more, you're proving to yourself that you really do believe it. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
At a certain point, that
Yeah.
just
But I think that's why that actually is why people sometimes do bad things. I mean, I don't feel like I did. I'm lucky that I never became an elder, because I think when you're an elder, you're if
quickly part of the system, then, aren't
you
you?
are, and if you do judicial committees, then you're personally responsible for separating families sometimes. And that must weigh quite heavily, especially if you leave. I do sympathise with former elders who've had to come to terms with some of that. I do feel empathy for those people. I never had that to worry about, but I do remember knocking on doors and talking to people about the truth, as we called it, who just, what was I doing? I remember calling on old people. They'd buy the magazines off us, and we're going for a coffee. And it was just, I suppose I'd have somebody to chat to, but we were just telling them nonsense. I remember, I think I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it on the podcast, but I remember knocking on this old woman's door and telling her about the new system and how God was going to make everything new, and the paradise and all of that. And she looked at me and she said, "Is it coming down my street?"
Oh dear.
And I said, "Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Would you like these magazines? It tells you all about it." And that's a bit heartless, really, isn't it? And I had my doubts at the time, but I'm carrying on telling this person this load of nonsense. And I'm getting a magazine placement in. So there are times when I feel a bit of guilt for that. And, the times when I've walked past disfellowship people, or my attitudes towards gay people, these are things that I regret now. Things I may have said in the past about that. So I think we all do carry some guilt. But yeah, we are, as you're quite rightly quoting Janja Dalic, we are all perpetrators to some degree when we are in these groups. And we're doing it because that's what we're expected to do. And part of it is to prove to ourselves that we are in it. Okay. There was one final element that because I asked your mum actually before I started this. I just said to her, why do you think people do bad things as part of organisations? And she said, fear and going along with the crowd. And I thought, yeah, they're really good ones actually. And so I wanted to touch on Solomon Ash's experiments into conformity. And these have been sort of redone and done over and over again. They're really interesting experiments. I think the classic Solomon Ash one was you get one person who's actually the experiment is being done on, one subject, one participant. The rest of the group in a room are all Confederates, and the teacher is there, and you've got two lines. He's showing you two lines, and it's basically which one is the longest line, or are they the same length? So it's a very simple task. And obviously everybody gives the wrong answer. Apart from this poor sod who is looking at everybody thinking, I must be misunderstanding something. Yeah, and they, of course, more often than not, just go along with everybody else, knowing the very evidence of their own eyes. And there's been other experiments where you've got a room full of people on a computer, on computers, and there's smoke coming through the door, underneath the door, and everybody's kind of sort of happily tapping away at their computer. And this poor one guy's looking around thinking, why is nobody leaving?
It's like Darren Brown when he selects people for his stuff, isn't it? He's looking for people that go with the crowd. That's the whole point.
That's right.
So they start dinging a bell, don't they? And people stand up that are plants.
That's right.
And then, eventually the person that has no idea what's going on starts standing up with the bell and sitting down. And obviously those are the people he wants for his wacky shows. But so going with the crowd is a thing.
So that's important. And fear, yes, of course, people do. Part of that is fear of standing out from the crowd. So fear is related to that. But sometimes the fear is, I'll get told off if I don't do this, or
repercussions.
Repercussions. Yeah. So of course those are very important too. So yeah, lots of reasons then why seemingly good people, normal people, can do some really bad things in organizations, which applies to everybody really, us included, whether we're a member of a cult or not. These ethical questions come up in the workplace as well. So I think it's a really interesting topic.
So I think this has been a little pat on the back time. I think we've done quite a good job there. We took you on a journey, dear listener.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting areas that you can get into more if you want to. I'll put the links on the show notes if you want to check out the papers. There's quite a lot of technical stuff in there, but you can have a read.
But yeah, I think it was a nice way of talking it through, in the sense that it could be quite a depressing slog. You know what I mean? Of just like, you know why this could have been a sad episode. But I think it was just more interesting and just taking a bit of a top-down look at it and to understand why, and not a pointing fingers and saying everyone's horrible. It's just how can people do this from
it's kind of I think it is good to think about this every now and again, because it is easy for us to end up in positions where we're doing things that we've really regretted. The chief executive, the former chief executive of the post office, she was recently awarded a CBE, which is like an honour from the Queen, and there's been a big clamour for her to give that back now, and she's kind of public enemy number one, this executive, and she doesn't deserve an award, definitely, so she should give it back, or it should be taken off her. But I think there's a risk that she just becomes the fall woman for everything, really. Clearly it wasn't all her. I should mention that Fujitsu were the makers of the software, so they're as guilty as of the post office in many ways.
Which apparently they're still using that software.
And just landed a nice big contract for something else apparently as well.
Yeah, this is the thing.
Anyway, that'll do. So I just wanted to say before we go, next week we have a very interesting interview with Carmel Michael, and she has made a short film, actually. So I will put the link to that short film on the show notes too, so it gives you a chance to watch that
before your homework.
Yes, right. It's good to do a bit of homework, so you can watch the film. It's great. It's very easy to watch. It's quite short. So we've already done that interview, but I'll be editing that next week, so we'll bring that to you next time. So hang in for that one. Good. All right. Well, thank you, Celine. Enjoyed that, and thank you for listening, everyone. And we'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.